So anyway, some years ago, I got caught up in some discussions about flat Earth. And I enjoy them. I enjoy the discussions greatly, and I enjoy the people I talk about with it. I mean, it's a fascination to me. It's really fun, and in those discussions, it was such a foreign idea to me, because after all, I was raised during this space age. I was alive when they walked on the moon. I watched it live on TV, and so I'm pretty bought into the idea of spherical Earths and things like that. So it was just a fascination to me, these discussions, and this is not a bad representation of the idea. The idea from a flat Earth perspective is that the Earth is not a globe; it's actually a flat disk, like a CD or a record, and that the center of the disk is the North Pole, and the South Pole is the entire edge, which is why in this picture it's all white. So Antarctic is actually the whole white edge. It's a fascinating idea. And when you stop and think about it, you think, well, gosh, how do I know that that's not the case? What do I see in my experience I can change? So we have just great discussions about that. Or if you take this model and you look down from the top of the flat Earth model, you'll see something kind of like this, where there's the flat disk, and then the sun and the moon kind of go around. They sort of go around the top of it and circle it, and it makes light where the sun is and it's dark where the moon is, stuff like that. So I mean, it's pretty fun. The discussions got kind of stuck scientifically with the people I was talking to, so they referred me to a fella. They said, you need to talk to this guy because he really knows his stuff, and he lives somewhere else in the country. So this other guy and I got on this whole discussion because he said, yeah, he really knows what he's talking about. So Jim, you need to talk to this guy. I go, okay, yeah, I'd love to talk to him. So we started some discussions. It was around the time of the big solar eclipse that came across the country, I think in 2017, 18, somewhere around there. I can't remember exactly, but it was around that time. And so on the phone, we were discussing, he says, well, the fact that the total eclipse is this dot of darkness that grows across the United States really, really fast proves flat Earth. And so we got into a discussion about how does that prove flat Earth. It was really a fun discussion. I enjoy these discussions. And then all of a sudden, the discussion started to get a little contentious because I kept pushing back against some of his scientific arguments. And I said, that is not a scientific argument. Don't you realize? And I point out the problems with his science. And if you know me, I have a big science background. I'm steeped in scientific method, but the things he was bringing up scientifically was kind of ludicrous. And so I'm enjoying the discussion, but at this point, suddenly we're at this impasse because he's using what he's thinking is just ironclad scientific proofs, and I'm going, no, actually, what you're saying is totally the opposite. And then I realized there was the fundamental problem was that our science backgrounds were different. So then I asked him on the phone. I said, so what is your professional training? Because this was a very intelligent man. I have to say this several times. I enjoyed talking to him. It was just a delight to talk to him. And he says, well, my training, my professional training is I'm a lawyer. I know the law. I said, do you have any scientific training? Well, whatever I got in junior high. and I said, okay, now look, here's the deal. I said, the arguments you're making from a scientific perspective, you're mishandling them. And anyone who has even a slight scientific background, you'll just be embarrassing yourself. You're just embarrassing yourself. These are ludicrous arguments. You're embarrassing yourself. And at that point, the conversation stopped when he replied to me, I've never seen such hubris. Well, now, being a scientific guy, I'm not very good in English, so I had to look up what hubris means. But I realized that hubris is when someone thinks you're overconfident and kind of pompous because of what you believe, and it's just your ego that's driving your pomposity rather than your persuasion about the truth of it. So at that point, he slammed the phone down, and that was the end of it. Because I had such hubris because I was insisting science. So what's that have to do with today? Many times, and Paul will show this in Galatians, many times when you're persuaded about a truth and you're bold about presenting it, you're not backing off on that truth. And when I'm saying this, I'm talking about the gospel and who Jesus is. Many times that's misinterpreted by people as being hubris or being proud. And in this particular case, in the letter to the Galatians, I think that's the problem that Paul is anticipating that the people in Galatia had when he first traveled there. So we're going to see that today. And we're going to see how Paul changes this false impression that it's hubris that's having Paul being so insistent on the gospel. It's not hubris. It's not pride. It's not ego. It's something else. So that's what we're going to look at today. We're going to look at Galatians. Such hubris. I now use that word all the time. Well, actually, I don't. I don't find many people that have hubris. But I'm waiting. I'm really waiting for it because I want to be able to lay down that hubris word, you know. And now I understand. So feel free to use it on me. Exactly. Yeah, tit for tat. It works for me. Okay. We're going back to this. I'm going to do the context one more time in case you missed it, because the book of Galatians, the letter of Galatians, was written in a very specific context after Paul had been in a certain region. So I'll just do this one more time. Paul's in Antioch after he comes to Jesus on the road to Damascus, and he goes on this first of 3 tours that we have documented. This first tour, and this is the one that's important, in around 46, he goes to Cyprus and up to Antioch in Turkey, then Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe. He's deep in the Galatian region of central Turkey. And then, in fact, he's stoned in Lystra and left for dead. I mean, it's a good response in many places he goes, and a bad response. It's very violent. And then he has to go back home, and he has to backtrack from Derbe back through those regions that were so antagonistic toward him. He went back through those places. I would have gone home another way, Paul. So he goes back to Antioch, and when he comes back, the church is delighted with the stories they tell when they come back. And this is what Luke records for us in Acts, what the church responded when they came back. And when they arrived and gathered the church together, they declared all that God had done with them and how he had opened a door of faith to the Gentiles. That's a big deal. That's a big deal, how God had opened a door of faith to the Gentiles, and there remained no little time with the disciples. So Paul and Barnabas come back to Antioch after this first tour, just exulting in what God has done, even though they're coming back bruised, almost left for dead in Lystra. I mean, the gospel came and people responded. In fact, in another place, even many of the very religious Jews, priests even in Jerusalem, we'll see later, they come to faith and they obey by faith what they hear. But it's not uniformly received. As there are so many people who come and they receive it willfully and joyfully. It's a wonderful good news. That's why the gospel means good news. To some people, it came across as bad news, as threatening news. And so here's what they tell. But the amazing thing in Antioch, the Antioch church, they're amazed that Paul and Barnabas went off through parts of Cyprus, and then they went on through parts of Turkey, which is Asia Minor at the time. And even the Gentiles responded. It's amazing. It's a great story. So that's where we are. However, after he comes back, he starts getting word from people we think about the next year that what they believe in the places in Galatia has started to drift. And it started to drift in the direction of the antagonists, the guys who tried to kill Paul. And so Paul writes this letter, and in this letter he boldly and arrestingly says, I'm astonished you have so quickly deserted him who called you in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel. So this is the arresting opening statement that Paul has with these guys. I was just with you. Why is it you've changed so much? And that's why the letter of Galatians is written to deal with this issue. Something has changed. Now the question we got to figure out, since we don't have any other documentation about what they believe in Galatia in those regions, we got to figure out what they drifted to. And last time we talked about the fact that the gospel has been distorted. And even a 1% distortion gives you a 100% phony gospel. So what we need to do by way of kind of joining in the wisdom of resisting those distortions is to figure out what got distorted after Paul left, and then making sure that in our age we don't have similar things that come in and distort the gospel and hence completely torpedo the power of it. That's what we're on this search to do. And I'm your tour guide on this search to find out these distortions. So this is where we go. So we're in Galatians 1, and I just remind you how he had finished talking last time. As we've said before, so now I say again, if anyone is preaching to you a gospel contrary to the one you received, let him be accursed. He's really quite direct, quite straightforward, and quite insistent that it doesn't matter who the authority is that's giving you a different gospel, they are accursed. And it's not that Paul curses them, it's that they stand by being cursed by God because they've twisted the gospel. You do not want to twist the gospel and hence prevent people from coming to God because you've distorted it. You are cursed by God. It's a really bad position to be in. So how different is the different gospel? Well, we're still trying to figure that out, but we'll push on today and see. Now, was this thing he's doing, let them be accursed, is this Paul's ego? Is this Paul's hubris sticking out right here? Is Paul saying such forceful things like this because he's so offended that his authority has been challenged and they don't believe him anymore? Do you know who I am? Is this Paul's hubris? See, I got to use the word. Well, let's find out. Let's go on. Verse 10. For am I now seeking the approval of man or God? You know, hubris happens when it feels like someone is pushing their own reputation over your own. And it's kind of a sword play of man pleasing in a way. So what he's saying, am I now seeking the approval of man or of God? Or am I trying to please man? Is that what I'm up to? If I were still trying to please man, I would not be a servant of the Messiah, which is his code word of saying, if I was trying to please man, I wouldn't have put up with all the violence I just went through in Lystra. No, I wouldn't be serving Christ because I'd say, never mind, this is going to be too defining, too horrible. Verse 11, for I would have you know, brothers, that the gospel that was preached by me is not man's gospel. And when he says that, he's saying, look, I didn't make this up and someone else didn't make this up. He's leaning in the fact that he's been so insistent about what the gospel is, not because we have men's egos tied up with something that they made up. This is something bigger than that. It's different than that. And it's clearly not something I've made up. This is not a man's gospel. For I didn't receive it from any man, nor was I taught it. Really? Well, if you didn't get the gospel from some other men, like at the feet of the apostles, isn't that where Paul got his gospel? Is that where he heard about Jesus? He says, no, I didn't receive this from men, nor was I taught it from men. No, in fact, I received it through a revelation of Jesus the Messiah. Now, if you're like me, you're thinking, I've heard a lot of false prophets say that. I've had a vision from God. Well, why don't you tell me about it, and I'll judge whether it's really a vision from God. You know what I mean? We need to be automatically skeptical. And so when Paul even says this, in a way, in a respectful way, I'm being automatically skeptical. He's saying, look, this gospel that you've heard, that I've given to you, that you better not let anyone cross it because it's an important thing. The gospel didn't come from men. We're not making this up. This is not just a weaker version of someone's stronger version of some religious thing. It's not that at all. This came directly from God. This came from Jesus. So that's the power. That's why I'm insistent on it, because this isn't a man-made strategy. So what he's trying to say here, and he's going to build on this, what drives me is not my egotistical need for respect. That is not what's driving me, why I'm so insistent about the gospel in this particular case. I'm not driving for my ego to be magnified. I'm insistent. What drives me is the divine origin of the message. That's what drives me. So don't misunderstand what I'm saying here. I'm not insistent because I'm offended because you don't respect me because I'm the guy who brought you the message. It's not a man issue. It's not an ego issue. It's not a hubris issue. The issue is I'm insistent on this because this has come from God. It's a big deal. It's a big deal. This is what he says in the opening of Romans. I'm eager to preach the gospel to you also who are in Rome. For I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It's the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. And you hear in his voice this insistence that this gospel, when I tell you the truth, I can communicate the gospel with my words. Once you hear it and you embrace it and you believe it, it's the power of God for salvation. This is not some trivial issue. This is not some self-help thing guru coming through town saying this is what you need to do to live a bigger and fuller life. No, this is an issue of salvation, and this is an issue that all you have to do is hear it, believe it, embrace it, and the power is there. That's how powerful the gospel is. It can be communicated very simply. And when someone accepts it and believes it, it happens. The salvation happens. I've always been interested in people's stories, how they come to the Lord. Have you ever asked people, how'd you come to the Lord? And sometimes the stories are very dramatic, right? like super dramatic. Well, I was a full-time drug user and I was living in the gutter in Los Angeles, and everything was horrible, and they tell you a horrible life. And then, dramatic, and it changes. I got all cleaned up and now I'm living this wonderful life, and that there's that kind of story, which is not the kind of story most of us have. Most of us, the story is very simple. It's very simple. And what you accept is so simple that when you hear it told, you think, that's it? That's it? And the entire course of your life changed? That's it? I mean, mine's a good example, and yours is probably as simple in terms of the gospel, because I was 15 years old. I had just gone through New Year's Eve, and now it was on New Year's Day. It was minutes after the top of midnight after New Year's. I was by myself, and my brothers had gone off to parties, and my parents were at home. I watched that ball come down in Times Square, and okay. So I'm sitting on my bed, and I'm getting ready to go to sleep. It's probably somewhere close to 12:02, and I'm looking out the window. I see stars outside. And it's just suddenly dawned on me. I thought, this is a big New Year's, because we went from, you can do the math now, went from the 60s to the 70s. So this was a couple minutes into 1970. And I was thinking big thoughts, because I thought, my whole life has been in the 60s. And now moving into the 70s. That's like a big change. It's like a big page turn. And so I started to think, as a 15-year-old, big thoughts about my future. And it dawned on me as I was thinking about my future, I'm thinking, in the 70s, I probably will graduate from high school. I was a couple years away from graduating. I'd probably graduate. Gosh, in the 70s, I might actually go to college. Wow. And by the end of the 70s, I might actually graduate from college. I'm fortunate to have that happen. And oh my gosh, and by the end of the 70s, I might be married. I was. And there's a 15-year-old looking forward, thinking big thoughts. And I even thought, I might have some kids before the end of the 70s. As a 15-year-old, that's a pretty scary thought. We didn't. But it was close. It was close. Yeah, 81. So I'm thinking all these big thoughts, and I'm staring at this starry sky. And then suddenly, all I can say was an encounter. There was no bright, shining angel in the room or anything. There was nothing that would disturb you. If you were watching, from a hidden camera, you wouldn't see anything happening big. But then the thought started occurring to me that with so much at stake in my near future, in this new epic, this new 70s, with so much at stake, I wonder if I'm really on top of getting to where I want to be. I wonder if I'm smart enough to actually find life in those things that are opening up to me. I think I'm not. And then it dawned on me, and I don't know where this information came from, but it's as though God was saying to me, well, you're right. You have a profound ability to screw up the rest of your life. But here's the deal. You are at a fork in the road. You can go your way with all of your doubts and all of your anxieties about where that's going to go and all the uncertainties that are there. Or you can go my way and trust that I'll take care of you and I'll put you on the right track and we'll get to where you want to be in life. And I sat there and thought for a second, well, okay. Okay, I'll go your way then. And God impressed upon me. Now you realize that means you have to let me run the show. I go, well, yeah. Now, when that thought came to my mind, this is a strange little dialogue with God. When that thought came to my mind, I said, you run the show, you run the show. Well, what if he sends you to New Guinea to be a full-time missionary until you die? Well, God, I can't do that, okay? So I'll let you run the show as long as we don't go to New Guinea as a missionary, because after all, I can't speak to people. And I was tragically, physically ill when I would try and speak to people. Physically ill. I failed tests, and I've told these stories before because I wouldn't ask for a pencil to do the tests in school. That's how shy I was. So I said, God, I'll trust you with everything, but you got to understand, in case you don't know already, I don't really talk to people. So I'll let you control this thing as long as you don't have to have me talk to people. Is that working? And the answer was silence. He said nothing. I think, in fact, he put his phone on mute and was chuckling for a while so I wouldn't hear him chuckle. Because even the thought of me doing what I'm doing right now would have terrified me. I probably would have run away with my hair on fire. And what I do in terms of talking with people, even in a large context, is one of those touch points I can go back to and say, this is real, because in a matter of a year to 2 years, that had completely changed. The next year, I was standing up in front of a youth group. What? So I won't tell you that whole story, but go back to the decision point. You can either run your life your way or you can run it my way. Are you willing to trust me to run your life for you, to take you into places of life? Are you willing to trust me? And I went, well, okay. And you're telling me that, well, okay, changed the future for me? It did. The gospel is a very simple thing. Now, at the moment, I didn't really have a thought about the fact that I didn't deserve it, that I was sinful and rebellious against God. That whole thing didn't factor in. That came in actually a little bit later. And when the realization of how unworthy I was to accept this great deal started to hit me, and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, but God still said yes. And I never realized the degree to which my sins were offensive to him. So my understanding of sin grew after that. But it didn't stop the very simple acceptance when God says, I have life for you. Do you want me to give it to you? And I said, okay. That's as simple as the gospel is. It doesn't have to be more complex than that. That's the gospel that Paul says, I'm not ashamed of this gospel. It's the power of God for salvation. To whoever believes that means to embrace it and to take it up and say, okay, I'm in. That's the power of this very simple message. God loves you, has a tremendous plan for your life. You have a problem with sin. God's taking care of the problem with sin because of Jesus dying on your behalf. You still are being offered this life from God. Do you want to take it, or do you want to just do your own thing, do what you want to do to control your future, or let God do it? So it really comes down to the very simple question. So Paul's telling us right here that he's insistent on the gospel because even the simplest version of the gospel, God uses it with power to bring salvation and life to people. So I am not going to waffle on the gospel. I'm not going to suffer when people distort it so that it completely disables it, which is what's happened now back in Galatia. I'm not going to tolerate that. Oh, Paul, you're so egotistical. You think it's your message. Such hubris. No, it's a divine message that has power. That's why he's insistent. So what he's trying to say is that he got a message from Jesus. It's a miracle. Paul is informed about what the gospel is, and it's a miracle. Now, is there a way he can prove that somehow this is a miracle, that he's got this message from God? Is there a way for him to separate himself from all of those ne'er-do-well TV preachers who say, you need to listen to me because I've got a message from God for you today? How do we separate Paul from those guys? He says, well, because it was a miracle. Well, Paul, can you prove it was a miracle? Well, yes, I can. He goes on. You've heard of my former life in Judaism? Huh? Have you heard of my former life in Judaism? How I persecuted the church of God violently and tried to destroy it? Have you heard of that? Have you heard of who I used to be? So he's coming down on the miracle proving by saying, I want you to understand what this simple gospel did to me. I used to be a persecutor of the church. I used to go around doing it. Well, let's look at some examples. Acts, here's the execution of Stephen, a well-respected man in the church in Jerusalem. And they cast him out of the city, talking about Stephen, and they stoned him. And the witnesses laid down their garments at the feet of a young man named Saul. This is the first century equivalent of hold my beer. This is like, no, hold my coat. I need to stone this guy. And so Paul is the guy who was in charge of holding the coats while everyone else stoned Stephen. He stood on and he approved of it. He approved of it. If we go on in Acts 8, Saul approved of his execution, and there arose on that day a great persecution against the church in Jerusalem. They were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria. That's Judea, the larger region of Jerusalem, Samaria, up north toward Galilee, except for the apostles. They stayed in town. Devout men buried Stephen and made great lamentation over him. And then verse 3 of Acts 8, but Saul was ravaging the church, entering house after house. He dragged off men and women and committed them to prison. Saul is his previous name to Paul. Saul is not Paul by name until you get to Acts 13, which, by the way, is the first missionary journey that we keep repeating. Somewhere in that missionary journey, people started referring to him as Paul instead of Saul. But Saul was persecuting the church. He wasn't just being nasty and irritating. He was violent, and he was trying to destroy it. And why? Well, because as a Pharisee Jew, his opinion was, based on his good information from the Old Testament, being an expert in the Old Testament, that I know what the Messiah needs to look like, and Jesus is not that Messiah. And so Paul took the attitude, which most of the religious community of Jews did, was that Jesus was a dangerous, dangerous imitation. He was a dangerous imposter. He's an imposter Messiah. After all, did he deliver us from Rome? No. Case closed. And so they decided they need to nip this in the bud. Why did they need to nip this in the bud? Well, because this imposter was creating huge crowds of following. That's dangerous, they said. We need to put a stop to this danger. We cannot have an imposter who's twisting all of our people who follow us, the religious leaders, who can teach you about the books of Moses and about the prophets. We got to do something about this. And so, basically, because of their jealousy of the crowd sizes that Jesus had, they decided they need to nip this in the bud and kill him. They're being protective, is what they would tell them. We're being protective of God's chosen people. We're being protective of God's chosen people against the imposters of the world. We need to be held up on a high standard as being lovely and wonderful men by killing Jesus. I mean, that was the mindset. And when you put it in that context, it sort of makes sense. And so when Paul brings the gospel through these areas, he's talking about Jesus, and yet that same reaction is coming from the Jewish leaders in those areas. That's why this is happening. Well, Paul was this in spades. This was his life. This was his life before he came to Jesus. Well, I should say before Jesus stopped him. This was his life. This is what Paul did. He persecuted the church. He tried to destroy the church. How is this message a miracle? Because of what it did to Paul. Because this was his previous life. How do you change this? He goes on. I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age among my people. So extremely zealous was I for the traditions of my fathers. He was an up-and-comer. He was a golden boy. He was a guy who was going to be in the ruling leadership in Jerusalem before anyone his age. He was really going. He was climbing high. He was ambitious. Could you say that this was Paul's ego? Yes! This is Paul's ego. I was ambitious and I was accomplishing. I was so accomplished, in fact, that I wasn't just going to settle for arresting and destroying Christians that were in Jerusalem. No, not me. I have a bigger horizon than just the people in Jerusalem. Yes. How do you know that? Well, this, Acts 9. Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus. Damascus, Syria. Damascus, 165 miles away. I asked for letters to the synagogues at Damascus so that if he found any belonging to the way, that's people following Jesus, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. That's how ambitious he was. I'll let my underlings here in Jerusalem take care of the Jerusalem imposters. As for me, I'm going to go to Syria and find them there. So to be able to do that, he couldn't just walk into the synagogues in Damascus. He had to have letters of introduction. And the letters of introduction would say something kind of like, this is Saul. He's cleansing the Jewish community from the influences of this imposter, Jesus. You need to let him have full sway in your town, and you need to report anyone who is one of those Jews that has started to follow Jesus. Because, just to remind you, in the beginning, Christianity was a Jewish sect. It was a Jewish sect. Jesus was Jewish. The apostles were Jewish. They believed in the Old Testament. They affirmed Moses. It was a Jewish sect. So this was Paul coming into town in Damascus with a letter that said, this man is ambitious, but he's also effective. He's been doing well here in Jerusalem. You need to rat on all the people who've been led away into this dangerous sect, and you need to let him know who they are, and he'll take them off your hands, and they'll stop causing all the problems there in Damascus. That's what he went into town with. Paul's ego? Yeah. Yeah, on brutal display. By the way, if you want to hear Paul tell the story himself, go read Acts 22 and 26, because he recounts this entire part of his life a couple times in Acts as he's in front of very important people, including kings. He tells this story firsthand. So if you want to hear Paul tell it firsthand, go to Acts 22 and 26. Really fun to hear him tell it himself. And then he says, but when he who had set me apart before I was born and who called me by his grace was pleased to reveal his son to me in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles. And I'm going to stop the sentence right there. We'll pick it up in just a second. But you got to stop for a second, because what he just said blew my socks off. So he remember, he just finished saying that I was out to destroy the church, so much so I actually left town and went to Damascus, Syria to find people. I was going to not let the church be destroyed. I was not going to let the Jews be destroyed. But when he who had set me apart, he's talking about God, before I was born, this change that happened in the Damascus Road experience when Jesus stops him, wait a second, you mean before I was born, he who had set me apart before I was born and who called me by his grace, we talked about grace last time, I always reflexively, and this might help you too, when I see the word grace, I put the word gift in, the other G word. So I say, and who called me by his gift, okay, was pleased to reveal his son to me. That's the Damascus Road experience, in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles. So what he's saying here is his prelude to the sentence he's going to finish in a second is this: even though I was accomplished in destroying the church, and I was making some good traction in that realm, I was making a good name for myself, unbelievably, God had other plans for me. And when did those plans start? Before I was born. What? And then he called me by the gift of his grace, which means he didn't look at Paul in the Damascus Road experience and say, I'm sorry, Paul, I really wanted to save you, but you are such an incredible dirtbag that, I'm sorry, I just don't have that much forgiveness for you. No, the gift of his grace. In the midst of, while he's screaming threats and murderous intent for the followers of Jesus, while he is doing that, God's grace, the gift of his grace, comes to him and says, got another job for you. You need to stop this. Why would God ever consider a man who was so dead set against the imposter Jesus, which is wrong? Why would God intend to use this man in any positive way? Wouldn't God just destroy this man? But God says, nope, I got plans for you. And guess what? You're going to laugh when I tell you, Paul, but even though you think Jesus is an imposter and you're trying to kill everyone who's following him, I'm going to have you now be the best spokesman for Jesus that has been yet. What do you think about that? Yeah? Is that ironic or what? Capital I, ironic. And in the process, the Son is revealed to him. That's the Damascus Road experience. The Son wasn't revealed to Paul just to stop him what he was doing. The Son was revealed to him in order to change the course of his life entirely 180 degrees, the opposite direction. Now, what Pharisee, who's the golden boy, ambitious accomplisher for the Pharisees, what golden boy is going to give all that up and turn the opposite direction and suddenly become the target of those who want to destroy the followers of Jesus? Who does that willingly? No one does. No one does. Which is why Paul's saying it's a miracle. The gospel is a miracle. And if you want to see case number one for how this is a visible miracle, he says, look at me. If the gospel can do this to me, this is the power of God for salvation to anyone who believes. If you don't think that my message of the gospel came from Jesus, then you don't understand why I'm no longer a Pharisee. That's all he's saying. It's proof text that it's a miracle. He called me. Well, let's just review the calling process. We just love reading this stuff. Acts 9, verse 3. Now, as he went on his way, this is Paul. He approached Damascus, Syria. Like I said, that's 165 miles. That at least is a week of travel on foot. Okay, and so he's coming near Damascus, breathing fire, anxious to take someone from Damascus and bring them back to Jerusalem. Suddenly a light from heaven shone around him, and falling to the ground, he heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And his answer, I have to chuckle. Don't you chuckle when you read stuff sometimes? It makes me chuckle. And he said, well, who are you? Come on, isn't that funny? Well, no, actually, it comes out of terror because he's fallen on the ground. And there's a voice from heaven. Okay, that's terrifying. Okay, that's terrifying. I don't want to make light of that. But when he hears, why are you persecuting me? And the voice is coming from heaven, wouldn't you think it's God? Which I think he does, but he's confused because clearly this seems like a divine message. It's coming from where we always think of where heaven is, where God is. The voice is coming from there. So, but I'm persecuting Jesus. I'm not persecuting God. I'm persecuting Jesus. I'm not the imposter. I'm not persecuting God. So he's confused in a really natural way and says to himself, I need to do an ID check here. Okay, so who are you that I'm persecuting? Jesus. Jesus. Wow. This light and this voice is Jesus. I'm Jesus whom you're persecuting. But rise, enter the city, Damascus, where he was headed. He's right outside it. Rise, enter the city. You'll be told what you're to do. And I think at that point, he'll say, yes, sir, because he's just amazed he's not a pile of ashes on the ground on the road to Damascus. So I'm supposed to still go into the city, into Damascus. I guess I'm not going to stick to my agenda. I'm not going to go into the synagogue, give them the letter from Jerusalem that gives me permission to arrest people. I guess I'm not going to do that. Well, then what am I supposed to tell? What am I supposed to do? It says right there. Go and I'll tell you what you're supposed to do. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And of course, in that process, you read further in Acts, there's this guy Ananias who's in Damascus, who's a believer. And he has some objections when God comes to Ananias and says, Ananias, look, there's this guy, Paul. He's called Saul. And I need you to tell him some stuff. And of course, Ananias's natural response is, whoa, wait a second. Isn't this the guy who arrests and kills? And even as Ananias says that, because he hears the reputation of Paul, he hears that, he's thinking, I was planning on running and hiding. Now, that's my speculation, but that's be what I was doing if I was Ananias. And God's saying, you need to go talk to this Paul guy. I say, no, I was going to go hide in a closet somewhere. Because this guy comes and arrests people and takes them to Jerusalem and has them killed. And God says, no, Ananias, you need to talk to him. You need to talk to him. And so God graciously reveals to Ananias his plans for Paul. So he understands what's going on here. And so as we look a little bit further, Acts 9, verse 15, to a skeptical Ananias, after Ananias speaks his heart, and the Lord says to him, look, go, for he's a chosen instrument of mine to carry my name before the Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel. So God says to Ananias, I know the reputation this guy has. I'm fully aware of it, God's saying. I get it. But you don't understand. He's my chosen instrument. He's my chosen instrument. Which it had to blow Ananias' mind when he heard that. This is the guy who's destroying things, and you're going to employ him? You're going to speak through him, which is what the chosen instrument, the instrument is actually the speaking through thing. You're going to speak through this guy? And a chosen instrument to carry my name, to represent my name before the Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel. But he's a murderous guy. He's violent. He's trying to destroy the followers of Jesus. God says, well, not anymore. We've had a talk on the road, and everything's changing. He's going to go my way now. And then go and read it. This whole episode with Ananias and Paul, it's thrilling. So Ananias kind of sucks it up, and he goes to Paul, and he tells him, well, God's got a job for you. And interestingly enough, it's with the Gentiles. Do you know what Pharisees think of Gentiles? So he's having to process a lot of things here. Poor Paul. For one thing, a voice comes from heaven with a gigantic light. It feels like God's giving me a message, and he's saying, you're persecuting me, but I'm not persecuting you, God. I'm actually protecting your people. I don't understand. Why would you think I'm persecuting you? I'm actually serving you. And then God says, I'm Jesus. You're persecuting me. But that voice came out of heaven. Does that mean that Jesus is something more than just the man imposter? Okay, I have to deal with this. I have to deal with this. If this is true, then God's going to toast me with a lightning bolt right now. But he doesn't. He says, no, go into the town, and I'll tell you what you need to do. He still wants me to do something. And then this Ananias guy comes, and I'm supposed to do something with the Gentiles. I mean, this is not what was on my agenda this week. My agenda said, take the week, walk to Damascus, gather some people that you can, put in shackles, bring them back to Jerusalem, and we'll have a great time and, wash, rinse, repeat. I'll do it again. And this was not on my card for this week. He's a chosen instrument. I love that phrase, a chosen instrument. Now, based on what you've already seen in the passage, when did he become a chosen instrument on the timeline? Before the beginning of everything. At the beginning. Wow. Okay, if this isn't blowing your mind a little bit, then you're just not listening. You mean that like at the beginning of time, and God, who's timeless, looks out over the timeline of history, and he happens to use his telescope. He sees this Saul breathing fire dude out there, and he looks at him and he says, he's my chosen instrument. What? Are you kidding me? Yeah, that's the guy right there. Yeah. Of course, I'm going to have to knock him off his horse in Damascus. But that's, chosen instrument. Chosen before the beginning. Wow. Okay, so the sentence I left you hanging. Before I was born, he who called me by his grace was pleased to reveal his son to me in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles. I mean, that's a radical statement right there. And I didn't immediately consult with anyone. So this is where he's getting back to the origin of the message. Remember, he said it came from Jesus directly. Now I want to tell you, I didn't get it from any men, in case that's part of your criticism about why I'm being so persistent here. I didn't immediately consult with anyone, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me. But I went into Arabia and returned again to Damascus. So he makes the trip from Jerusalem as the bad guy to go arrest and kill people. He gets up to Damascus. Boom! Damascus Road experience. Jesus stops him. Quit persecuting me. I've got a plan for you. And he says at that point, what would have been the natural thing to do once he came to understand that Jesus was not an imposter, but was, he might be God's something, maybe the Messiah. I don't know. Wouldn't your first impulse be to go down to Jerusalem where the apostles are? That makes just a ton of sense. I need to go down there and talk to those guys and see how I missed it. Boy, I don't know what's going on. But he says I didn't do that. I didn't go to Jerusalem. Instead, I went into the town, which is what God told me to do. And after that, I went away into Arabia. Well, Arabia is everything to the right and kind of bottom over. He goes that way, goes to the right, and then returns again to Damascus. He doesn't go to Jerusalem. Okay. He's still trying to figure this out. Verse 18, and then after 3 years, still in Damascus, trying to get his head straight, I went up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas. So now he does the 165 miles again down to here to visit Cephas, that's Peter, and I remained with him 15 days, but I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother, who technically is not an apostle. In what I'm writing to you before God, I'm not lying to you. This is exactly what happened. So here I'm carrying this message. I understand the gospel. And now I finally made it to Jerusalem. And I just talked to Peter. And I was just with him for 2 weeks. And I didn't talk to any other apostles. No John, no Matthew. Didn't talk to any of those guys. And then he goes on to impress upon him how this gospel came to him. And then I went into the regions of Syria and Cilicia. So he's down in Jerusalem. He's just spent 2 weeks with Peter. And what does he decide to do? Well, let's just go up here. So he goes up the coast and he goes up to Syria, which is where he was in Damascus, but on the coast side of it. He goes up to Syria, and then he goes into Cilicia, which is this bottom part of Turkey, which, by the way, we talk of him as Saul of Tarsus. Tarsus is the academic center he was trained in. Tarsus is right there in the middle of Cilicia. It's up there. So he's in his own home turf, basically. I wondered too, and we don't know anything about this, since he came out of Tarsus, he was trained in Tarsus. He's an academic from a Pharisaic position. I wonder if he went back to his professors in Tarsus and said, got a question for you. Can you tell me more about what the Messiah is supposed to look like? I wonder if he went back and checked with his professors. Said, I'm struggling with something. I think I've got it kind of untangled, but you could really help me out here. His chops in terms of an academic Pharisee came out of Tarsus. So it's Tarsus had the same sort of kind of reputation that in the United States. If you think of a city in the United States that's identified as an academic center, many people think Boston. MIT's there, stuff like that. So it's that kind of idea. So I don't think it's a mistake to assume that he went up to talk to the people who had originally taught him. So I'm trying to get this all figured out. So anyway, he goes up to Syria and to Cilicia, but still, he says, down there in Judea, down here in Judea, I'm still unknown in person to the churches in Judea that are in the Messiah. So I'm still up here just doing my thing. I'm just doing I haven't consulted with any of the big dudes down here in Judea, except for Peter. I talked to Peter. In fact, down there, they were only hearing it said, and this is what people were saying, he who used to persecute us is now preaching the faith he once tried to destroy. Go figure. And they glorified God because of me. They are glorifying God because of me, because of this message. But clearly, he's not being sent from the apostles down in Jerusalem. And yet this guy who's trying to destroy the church is bringing increase to the church, and they're glorifying God because of what he's doing. Now that is a miracle in the flesh. And what changed it? The revelation that Jesus is indeed the Messiah. And Paul embraced that, and he believed that, and the entire course of his life changed. How much? By a lot. So that's why Paul's saying, what I'm telling you is the power of God for those who believe. For the Jew first and also the Greek. It's the power of God to believe. That's the gospel. Don't let it get twisted in your minds, because in its purest form it has gigantic power. Don't let yourself be distracted from that, because look what it did to my life, and this can free you from the captivity of sin in your life. This is the power we're talking about. I'm not going to mess around with anyone who's distorting the gospel and turning it into 100% phony. It's wrong. I'm not full of hubris. I'm full of passion for God. Okay, we're done. Let's take a second and reflect for a little bit, because I went over a section very slow, or very fast. Now I want to go through it slow, just really quick. By the way, in Bible study, this is called the application part of Bible study, where you read something. We just got up to our eyeballs looking at the narrative of Paul coming to Jesus and his trying to correct the gospel errors that were emerging in Galatia. And he said something that even to this day blows my mind. It makes me crazy just to read it again. So I want to focus on this. So what do you believe about yourself? Were you set apart before you were born by God? Do you embrace that? That before the beginning of the creation of the universe, he looked forward and said, that one's mine. Do you realize he had you in his sights before he made the universe? Now, this is just not something that's true of Paul, because Paul's a special guy. After all, he is an apostle. We're talking the apostle Paul. This might be true for him. No, when you read the Spanish scriptures, this is true of all of us. God had you in his eye before anything was ever made, and he was delighted. And that in the face of, like Paul, in the face of a lifetime of sin on your part. Now, it might not have been quite as dramatic as hauling people off to jail and hoping they get killed. That may not be your past. Well, I don't know. No, I don't think it's part of your past. But even still, our past without God is pretty heinous. It's full of a lot of hubris, full of a lot of pride. It's full of a lot of me-ness, self-centeredness. And to a God who owns the universe, that's pretty offensive. And yet God sees you from the distance and goes, boy, I love that one. I love that one. He's thought that about you before anything was made. Or do you live your life day by day in opposition to that, telling yourself, well, I've only recently been noticed by God. I came on his radar a couple of years ago, or for me in 1970. No, that's just the opening of a new phase of what his plan had been all along for you. He's known you since the beginning of the universe. And he delights in you. Do you know that you also were called by his grace? Called by his gift. What he gives to you, not what you earn or what you try and pay for ahead of time. He calls you because he wants to give to you, not because he wants you to earn it. You've been called by that grace. Or do you constantly think of yourself as, well, he called me because of my goodness. I'm after all better than a lot of people, so that's why he called me to be part of his kingdom. Yeah, you should be laughing at that. Because in his little telescope from the beginning of time, he looks and he sees, I love that one and I delight in that one, even despite all this wretchedness of sin. I've got a solution to this. And they're going to embrace that and they're going to love it. Paul says, while we were yet sinning, Christ died for us. He didn't wait for you to stop sinning. You've been called by his grace. That's a free gift. That's a free gift that magnifies in dimension based on your understanding of how pervasive the sin was in your life. I think, I say this, and I'm not lying, like he says, when I came to the Lord, when I did this kind of fork in the road decision, I thought of myself as pretty good. I'm not heinous. I'm not horrible. I'm a pretty nice guy. Comparatively speaking, on the goodness scale, I may not be a 10 or an 11, but I'm somewhere around a 3 or a 4. And I know a lot of people, including Vito Passamiente, who beat me up a lot, who's on like a 1 or a 0. Right? So you always compare yourself to people who are worse than you. So sometimes we slip into this errant thinking that God has called me into his kingdom and he gives us the gift of free life because he saw something better in us, when in fact he knew the fullness of our badness. And it was in the face of that, he's not fooling himself about it, he saved us despite that. Now, just a slight micro application. There are people that we easily hate. Many times because they annoy us. or because it's fun to hate some people. It is. I fully admit that. But there's people that we hate. Most of the time. Well, I hope that I always ask God to give me a perspective that he had about me before he called me to himself. He saw all the trash that I was involved in. He saw all the dirtbagness. And yet, he didn't say all that stuff was good. He didn't say that's okay. He didn't say that's okay. But he looked past and through that to the person that he loved. I ask when people impact me as someone that I would prefer to hate. I say, God, I need to look past those things, especially if they're personally directed toward me. I need to look past those things and see the person that God loves. Because after all, that's what God did with me when he looked so long ago. So, just saying, we're called by his grace. We're not called by anyone's goodness. Also, did you know you also had the Son revealed to you? As opposed to, are you thinking, well, I accidentally discovered the Son on my own. I was reading one day in the Bible, and I read Matthew, and wow, I accidentally discovered Jesus. No, actually, God himself revealed this to you. This is a big theme all throughout. It's even spoken about the fact that if you have faith, it's faith that was given to you by God. You can't take credit for any of this stuff. You can't even take any credit for discovering Jesus, because after all, Jesus was revealed to you by God himself. It was a deliberate action on God's part. And you sat there and went, oh, okay, wow. But he came to you. In the same way, but in a less dramatic context, as the Damascus Road experience for Paul. Was Paul seeking Jesus? No! Jesus sought him. He revealed himself to Paul. In that same way, we have a debt of gratitude to God that he has revealed Jesus to us. it really is a pretty amazing thing if you think about it, because here we are, how many years? 2,000 years after Jesus? And yet somehow we read something about Jesus, and you try and look at the circumstances of how it is you came to be a positive follower of Jesus, and you can try and put together the sociology of it and say, well, I wrestled with it for a while, and I did the pro-con sheet. I made some columns on a sheet, pro-Jesus, con-Jesus. But, in the end, that's not it. There's something that happened that now, 2,000 years after the fact, you understood something, and you said, I embrace who he is. I believe who he is. I follow him. 2,000 years later. That is, come on, that's a miracle. He reveals Jesus to you. And so you need to be thankful about that. It's not just something that you kind of stumbled over recently. And then lastly, do you know that you also are a chosen instrument? Oh no! As opposed to, well, I'm not really that useful to God. I am limited in so many ways. No, you're a chosen vessel. Look, if you weren't a chosen vessel, a chosen instrument, then when you gave your life to Jesus, you'd be gone. You'd be taken to heaven. God says, I can't use you down here. Man, you're worthless. And it's true. We are worthless. Come on now. But God left us here because he says, I want you to let people know who I am. You really are a chosen instrument. If you're still here, you're a chosen instrument. And on the day you die, God says, well, your chosen instrument days are done. Good job. Well done, good and, faithful servant. Again, in Acts, there's a one section where I think it's Peter, you'll have to check me on this, where Peter is talking about the history of Israel as he's getting ready to lower the boom on who Jesus is and say, by the way, you killed the Messiah. But as he's building up to that, he's talking about the history of Israel. And he's talking about the history of Israel in a way to give his listeners a sense that I know what I'm talking about. I know the Old Testament too. And he speaks of David in passing. And he says basically about David, he says, when he fulfilled his task for God in his generation, he died. You mean there's a finite list of things we accomplish? And then when God says that's it, then you're gone. That's when you stop your chosen instrument pursuits. And it's a finite list. It's a finite list. But you are a chosen instrument. Now, you shouldn't compare your instrumentness with other people's instrumentness. We're not talking about starting churches necessarily, or about even standing in front of people and talking. It doesn't have to be that. It can be so many things in such I won't say smaller scale, because it's profound scales with some people. Very simple things you do in people's lives have tremendous impact because they're done through the Spirit, through you, in people's lives. You have the Spirit of God in you. So where you go, you bring light. You have an influence. You are an instrument. Paul says in one of his letters to the Corinthians, he says, look, it's as though I'm kind of a very common container. Look at a mayonnaise jar in your fridge. Take the mayonnaise out and the jar's left. You say, wow, what a great container. Stellar and exemplary in every way. No, it's just a common container. So Paul, when he writes to the Corinthians, says, I'm just a clay jar. I'm just an earthenware jar. But you know what's inside of me? An extraordinary treasure. And what's that treasure? The gospel itself. I'm not ashamed of it, he says. It's the power of God of salvation. And you, well, you're the mayonnaise jar. And when the message gets received, it's not because the mayonnaise jar is anything exceptional. It's because the contents are exceptional. You're a chosen instrument. This instrument just means a container. But God says, I want that container to carry me around to people who've never heard. Well, I do have one last one here. You can preach him. That's your message. You don't have to be what I call a used car salesman for the gospel. Anticipating the objections, pivoting and parrying and coming up with counter objections, that kind of thing that goes on in debate. You can just talk about who Jesus is. And interestingly enough, even though you think this isn't going to go anywhere, the Holy Spirit kind of comes close and talks to them and gives them faith, and then God himself reveals himself to them. It's not on the basis of your used car salesmanship. It's on the basis of God himself. God's the one who reveals. But you're still a chosen instrument, still a mayonnaise jar, still someone carrying around that message, and God can use that in powerful ways. You can preach Him even if you feel like you don't have a message. I think many times we think we don't have a message. And that kind of pushes us back. I'm not a trained debater on stuff theological, so how can I have these discussions? You don't have to. And in fact, just like Paul is doing right here, the biggest message that you carry around is what God has done in your life. With Paul, it changed him from being a destroyer of the church to being someone who's promoting Jesus. With you, it's whatever your story is. With me, which is very easy for me to go back to, I look at talking to people and I see such a radical change in a short amount of time. I go, well, that's me. That's what happened to me. And so many people I talk to, you need to stay with your realm, what you understand. What has Jesus been to you? What happened in your life since coming to Him? That's something you can tell someone, and they can't come up with academic arguments against it, because all you can say is, well, that's just what happened to me. So you're just going to have to deal with that. But the offer is open to you as well. Because Jesus, when He was talking about shepherds, good shepherds, bad shepherds, sheep, He says the good shepherd comes to give life and to bring life abundantly. And that's what He promises you. And oh, by the way, if you don't have the good shepherd, you're under the influence of the bad shepherd, who comes to kill, steal, and destroy. So, I mean, you got this message. You don't have to debate past that. And if people go, well, I don't think so, you don't have to come up with your plan B's and C's and D's. You can just say, well, it's been my experience, and I just wanted you to know. And by the way, it's not just been my experience. It's been the experience of billions of people for thousands of years. Yeah. You can do this. Okay, one closing comment about Paul's hubris and his ego. He writes the Corinth churches twice that we know of, probably 3 times, but in one of them he writes this: listen to the tone of his voice as he himself goes back and reminisces about these previous days of what he was doing. Listen to what he says. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. For I'm the least of the apostles, unworthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace, the gift of God, I am what I am. And by His grace, His gift toward me was not in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them. Though, it wasn't I, but the grace of God that is with me. So, whether then it was I or they, so we preach, and so you believe. What he says is what we can say. We do simple things for Jesus. Simple things. Don't underestimate what His Spirit does in conjunction with those simple things. You're a chosen instrument. And He loved you before the creation of the universe. And He set you aside for this moment. I think Paul is in as much astonishment as anyone is about what God has done to his life in changing him and radically turning him around. And so when he comes to insisting with the Galatians that they stay true to the gospel, he says, this is a message from God, and let me tell you why it's from God, because look what it did to me. Father, we thank you that you called us to yourself. And we understand that we just never deserved it and can't seek to pay it back nor earn it. It's all been you. And in the very simplicity of our hearts, we came to you and we embrace this news that is so good and this God who is so good. And as a result, everything has changed. Everything has changed. I pray that your Spirit that now lives in us will give us an understanding of how we're chosen instruments in whatever unique and fitting way you've made us to be those instruments. I pray you'd make us responsive to your call in the places you take us, and the routine things we do, and the things that we consider small but which in your hands turn out to be gigantic things for salvation for those who hear. And Father, we thank you for preserving this word to us that encourages us that even though our life doesn't take as dramatic a turn as Paul's, that still you've left us here as a chosen instrument to be lights in a very dark place, like pinpricks of light that stars are in a field of darkness, and to make us spokesmen of the incredible loving kindness of God toward us. So we just thank you for all these. Our hearts are thankful beyond expression for what you've done on our behalf. So thank you now in Jesus' name. Amen.